On the day of the German Western Offensive on May the 10th, 1940, the Morane-Saulnier MS.406 was numerically the main French fighter. 390 out of the 724 fighters on the French mainland were 406s. It equipped 13 of 24 single-seat fighter groups. As a result, its shortcomings, which placed French pilots at a technological disadvantage during their encounters with Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Bf-110s, were to weigh heavily on the course of the campaign. For this reason, there are various popular tellings of the Morane story that suggest it was the worst aircraft of the war. That's patently false. Although far from excellent, the 406 wasn't even the worst French fighter, let alone the worst of the war. But that said, it did suffer the worst loss-to-kill rate of any significant French fighter during the Battle of France. And if you compare the Morane 406 to the Hawker Hurricane, which in the fall of 1939 through to the summer of 1940 was the backbone of the RAF, you'll instantly see that the British fighter is 40 miles an hour faster and has a 50% lower wing loading. So the Hurricane pilot will be better able to choose when to fight, and when he's in that fight, he'll be able to turn inside the 406. Comparison with the Hurricane is for bragging rights. Comparison with the Bf-109E was a matter of life and death. And unfortunately for France, the Emile was nearly 80 miles an hour faster at 10,000 feet. It had 25% greater power to mass and the same wing loading. Even the Bf-110 was 40 miles an hour faster than the sedentary MS-406. To make matters even worse, the 406 was less survivable and took twice as many hours to construct as either type. Otherwise, it was just great. Exactly how France ended up trying to defend itself with MS-406s in May 1940 gets to the heart of the issue she had in preparing for an air war with Germany. It wasn't as if the aircraft was designed by amateurs. Aeroplane Morane-Saulnier was founded in 1911 by Ramon-Saulnier and the Morane brothers, Leon and Robert. Their speciality before and during the First World War and into the 1920s were parasol-winged monoplanes that offered unobstructed views downwards for observers and thus made excellent army cooperation and spotting aircraft. The Type L was actually the first operational fighter to have deflectors on its propellers to allow firing through the propeller arc. For a brief moment, the Morane-Saulnier aircraft was therefore king of the skies. But the compromises in maneuverability and strength brought by its wing configuration meant that it was rapidly superseded by biplanes. A brief resurgence in 1918 with the Type AI was curtailed because of recurrent structural issues with the wing. 1,210 were built before the end of the war. In late 1914, the company also began producing mid-winged braced monoplanes in limited numbers. These were interesting and multiple types were designed, but they were produced in batches of only tens of aircraft as biplanes were judged superior in the combat environment of the day. The bracing on the Morane's wing led to a great deal of drag, removing any potential performance advantages. In the lean 20s, Morane-Saulnier provided about 150 MS-132 trainers to the French Navy, then 75 of their MS-225 parasol-winged fighters as interim steps to cantilever monoplanes. The fact that these totally obsolete aircraft were delivered in November 1933 shows where the new Armee De L'Air was as Hitler took control in Germany. The 225 was a £3,500 aircraft when loaded, mounted just two Vickers machine guns, and it was capable of only 208 miles an hour flat out. They were mainly used as trainers, and they were retired in 1937. Then, in 1931, the Air Ministry issued a request for proposal for a monoplane fighter under the C-1, or Monoplane de Chasse designation. This called for a large-capacity supercharged engine, which in essence meant a 650 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12 XBRS. Morane-Saulnier submitted two proposals, one a parasol and the other an innovative low-winged all-metal aircraft designated MS-325. Although it had a braced two-spar wing, fixed undercarriage and open cockpit, the 325 was nevertheless a significant evolutionary step towards a truly high-performance fighter. One aircraft was produced in 1932, but the competition was won by Dewoitine. 381 of their D500 series aircraft were made, and they were actually used against Bf-109s during the Battle of France. I say all of this because I think it's important to know that Morane-Saulnier was a very experienced company in combat aircraft design. We're not talking about amateurs. When the 1934 competition to develop a 250-mile-an-hour capable fighter began, they knew as much as anyone in France about mass production or modern fighter design. The rest of the 1934 specification required endurance of 2.5 hours at cruising speed of at least 320 kilometers an hour, climbing times less than 6 minutes to reach 4,000 meters and 15 minutes to 8,000, armament of a 20mm cannon and two 7.5mm machine guns, each with 300 rounds of ammunition, or four 7.5mm machine guns. Excellent turning and general handling performance was a must, as was an enclosed cockpit and a radio. The ministry knew that this level of performance was unlikely to be competitive for long, but the D500 was likely to be obsolete on delivery, and the other modern fighters on order were small numbers of parasol wing D371 and Loire 46s. Morane-Saulnier's entry to the competition was a low-wing cantilever monoplane with a retractable undercarriage, enclosed cockpit, landing flaps, and a variable pitch propeller. It was powered by a 36-litre water-cooled Hispano-Suiza 12Y31 engine. Despite this being 1934, the MS-405 was not a monocoque. It was built like an aircraft from a decade earlier, with a structure made of welded steel tubes covered with canvas on the aft fuselage. The forward and central fuselage and the wings were covered with a stressed skin made of plywood glued with thin aluminium plates. This material was called Plymax, and it offered high strength to mass versus a metal-only construction. But although that gave the impression of modernity, the Morane was over-engineered. Only 26 feet and 9 inches long with a 34 foot and 10-inch span, some sources having it weighing as much as 6,000 pounds gross. You'll generally see a lower figure in literature, but my view is that the often quoted 5,400 pound figure is based on pre-war propaganda rather than facts. Already at this point, well before series production, it was clear that the 405, as it was then, was strikingly hard to make and resource intensive relative to an equivalent British or German design. In a 1947 inquest into the type's failings, Guy Lechambre, who had been Minister for Aviation in 1938, testified that the Morane 405 had no fewer than 7,000 different parts, requiring the production of 6,000 specialized tools. The construction time for this machine was 14,000 to 20,000 hours. It's a machine that you cannot build in large series with large tools because it's a device designed by engineers who do not know what a machine tool is. The root cause of this problem was Morane-Saulnier's success in the political strife and social upheaval of the interwar period. They had become used to making aircraft in small batches with a unionized workforce, and therefore did little to reduce the complexity of their designs. What was the point when reduction in the labor required to make something could well lead to a strike, and assembly line production was banned by the left-leaning government to mollify the workers? As early as 1934, Morane did make attempts to simplify major structures, such as reducing the number of ribs in the wing to save £200, but their lack of experience in doing so and lack of incentive to implement any productivity improvements meant that it took 5 years to get the design into a state that it could be truly mass-produced. Just as that point was reached, on the 24th of May 1939, the Air Ministry decided to terminate production in favour of the superior Dewoitine D520. This act of lunacy has been accurately compared to the RAF deciding to terminate deliveries of Hurricanes in 1939 because they were also getting Spitfires. All of this was in the future. The first prototype was built at Puteaux and completed, ready for a first flight in August 1935. It had a fixed undercarriage for its first few flights, but this was switched for a retractable system early on in the program. After 80 hours of manufacturer's testing, it was passed on to the Armee De L'Air's test centre, the SEMA, in January 1936. Before it was dispatched, some modifications were made to the wing shape and its dihedral, and the slightly ungainly Chauvier variable pitch propeller was replaced by a Levasseur. At SEMA, the prototype 405 demonstrated excellent performance. It was capable of 304 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, and it could dive to 450 miles an hour. On July the 25th, 1936, the SEMA concluded a glowing report with these words: The Morane-405 possesses the qualities required by the C-1 aircraft of the 1934 program. Its value is a function solely of the quality of its performance. A second prototype flew for the first time in February 1937 and was delivered to SEMA in June 1937, with a further altered wing shape and a slightly different reduction gear driving the propeller. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in a fatal crash on the 29th of July 1937. Pre-production aircraft were already under construction by this point. The factory had been given an unofficial warning that orders would be forthcoming as early as August 1936, presumably under the auspices of the Plan 1 rearmament program. 15 MS-405s were then ordered in March of 1937. In the interim, the aviation minister, Pierre Cot, had the factory nationalised because he was rightly worried at how long everything was taking at Morane-Saulnier. The first of the aircraft was delivered on the 3rd of February 1938, and they dribbled out at a rate of roughly one every 3 to 4 weeks until December of that year. They were terrifically hard to make, requiring 33,000 man-hours per airframe at this stage and costing 965,000 francs apiece. That actually compares quite favourably to the Hawker Hurricane, which cost £7,250 in 1937. The issue that France faced at the time was that its economy was in a dire state. The currency was devalued on several occasions. £7,250 was about 750,000 francs in January 1937, but it was just over £1 million by December. Nevertheless, there was a great level of excitement about the Morane. In March 1937, only 3 years before the disastrous Battle of France, the weekly Les Isles reflected a widespread feeling in France when it wrote that the Morane-405 was undoubtedly the best of modern fighter planes. The fourth pre-production aircraft was the template for the production MS-406. Pre-production aircraft continued to be built while this aircraft was tested by SEMA from late May 1938 onwards. Like the 405, the 406 was built around its Hispano-Suiza 12Y motor. It was a motor cannon engine with a hollow boss to allow the fitting of a gun right down the aircraft's centerline. The engine was a liquid-cooled V12 that gave 860 horsepower at sea level at 2,400 RPM. The first aircraft delivered had a two-position, three-bladed, pneumatically controlled Chauvier 351 propeller that turned clockwise, which was then switched with an electrically controlled constant-speed radiator 1607. This did no end of good for climb and acceleration performance. The vast majority of aircraft had short, straight-tube exhausts, but some of the very earliest aircraft had flash suppressors for night flying. These were soon judged surplus to requirements and deleted. The radiator was a retractable system under the nose. Coolant was ethylene glycol. The engine drove an oil pump that pressurized the hydraulic system. That system operated the landing gear and the flaps. The gun firing circuit, engine starter, wheel brakes, landing gear locks, and fuel jettison system were all pneumatically operated, which would prove a major weakness in combat. The Viet engine starter would, however, prove very beneficial when the Morane squadrons were forced to relocate on an almost daily basis during the Battle of France in May 1940. To that end, the landing gear had a wide track and the tyres were low pressure. The small tail skid took around 10% of the aircraft's mass, with the rest on the sturdy front struts. Ease of landing was a definite benefit versus the Bf-109 and the Spitfire. Of course, the Moraine's pilot had to survive long enough to enjoy his landing experience. Main armament was that 20mm Hispano-Suiza HS-404 firing through the propeller boss. Its drum magazine contained 60 shells, a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, or explosive, for about 12 seconds of firing, if the firing circuit was working, of course. The gun was aimed with an OPL model 1931 internal reflector gun sight and a ring and bead ahead of the windshield. The gun sight was not well liked as it vibrated very badly, and thus it was quite hard to aim the guns precisely. The fuselage consisted of 4 longerons and 8 bulkheads. The first bulkheads had a steel framework and aluminium covering. The rest were in aluminium. Bracing was rigid at the front and then steel wire further back. Up to the cockpit, the frame was covered in aluminium, screwed or bent onto the frame. The rest was fabric covered. After the engine were 2 fuel tanks with a total capacity of 88 gallons. The upper tank was 66 gallons or thereabout, and the lower was 22. Unfortunately, the lower one was refueled through the upper, which led to slow refueling and thus slow turnaround on the ground. Worse still, although the pneumatic system could jettison fuel at a rapid rate, the tanks were not self-sealing. I assume this was a result of the lack of materials in the French aviation industry, as it would result in significantly reduced survivability. Lack of survivability was also evident in the cockpit. The windscreen wasn't bulletproof, and the canopy slid back on rails behind it. It was air-conditioned, and it had rollover protection via 4 steel tubes, but it lacked any armour. In October 1939, a dorsal steel armour plate was fitted. The aircraft did have a Thompson 53 or Radio Industry 357 radio, which allowed the pilot to communicate with the fighter commander. That role was intended to be performed by the third crewman in a Potez 63 that would accompany a large formation of single-engined fighters. The concept was the aerial equivalent of the methodical battle doctrine of the French army, and it was precisely the opposite of effective. The Morane wings were built around 2 stainless steel spars, and they had 11 ribs per side. They were covered with Climax and mounted at a 12-degree dihedral. Each wing held a Mac 1934 machine gun, fed by a 300-round drum. The tailplane had an aluminium frame, skinned with electron, a magnesium alloy developed in Britain about 30 years prior. During May 1938, the 2nd Squadron of the 7th Pursuit Wing, based at Rheims, received some of the pre-production MS-405s to perform operational testing. Several landing accidents resulted in the undercarriage being strengthened and that rollover bar being fitted, which was, as I said, standard on the production 406. Something that defied correction, though, was the fit of the canopy. It rarely sealed correctly, and therefore cold air entered the cockpit, causing condensation. The motor also vibrated excessively on its mounts in the forward fuselage, and the general finish of the forward fuselage skin was poor. Fixes for those problems weren't attempted by Morane-Saulnier. In general, though, the 405 was regarded as a reasonable aircraft and a significant upgrade to the squadron's combat effectiveness. Production 406s were rapidly introduced into squadrons as soon as this verdict was made. By the 21st of August 1939, shortly before the declaration of war, 12 pursuit fighter groups were equipped with them. 500 had been accepted and 367 were in operational use. The 406 quickly proved to be a very aerobatic aircraft. As a pilot who'd eventually take it into combat put it, we were called to fly the Morane, a very pleasant aircraft to pilot, classic in the line of its predecessors for its pure piloting qualities, excellent in aerobatics. It was less so in shooting because its machine guns only very rarely worked above 6,000 meters. Its biggest fault was, of course, its speed. 400 kilometers an hour was too little. The gun issue was caused by the mechanisms freezing, particularly during the exceptionally cold winter of 1939-40. Some units adapted signal light circuits to feed electric heaters in order to reduce this problem, but it was only a partial solution. Lack of firepower would prove another problem. The 7.5mm machine guns had little effect on German aircraft, and the aircraft carried too little ammunition to have much effect on bomber formations. The opposite was definitely not true. Lieutenant Theodore Griesbach flew the Bf-109 in the Battle of France. His recollection was that, and I quote, "The French Morane was a very fast aircraft, but had the tendency to catch fire due to its extremely light construction. We also learned that the armor plate that was behind the pilot apparently could not protect him against our machine gun ammunition." Later he noted that the armor plate in the 109 was outstanding. The French ammunition hardly left a mark on the polished steel plate. Our ammunition, in contrast, punched holes in the French armor, which was of very poor quality, due, as I heard later, to fraud on the part of the supplier. Commander Tricot of the 6th Fighter Wing succeeded in shooting down a Dornier 17, but was then pounced upon by 3 Bf-109s. He later recalled that he had no more armament. The Dornier 17 had undoubtedly hit my pneumatic circuit. I found the fate particularly cruel and unfair towards me because 4 or 5 years ago, at the 4th Squadron in Rheims, I had, during a winter job, asked for a weapon independent of the air circuit. Reliance on a complicated setup of pneumatic, hydraulic, and electrical circuits, none of which were redundant, meant that even a light hit from a machine gun bullet could easily damage something critical. Lack of self-sealing fuel tanks led to the fabric-covered aircraft catching fire easily, and lack of armor plate left pilots and systems vulnerable to damage. This was well known about in 1939, as a report to the Armee De L'Air stated that all of the numerous pneumatic, hydraulic, and electrical circuits which ran through the aircraft are absolutely not protected, and it is their great vulnerability, combined with the low power of the 12Y31 and the weakness of the armament, which will handicap the 406 the most in the war. It wasn't just German shells that caused problems for the poorly armoured 406. On August the 25th, 1939, Group 1-3 left the Dijon base for its operating ground at Varennes near Nancy. They landed around 4:30 p.m. Unfortunately, the field had rather a lot of stones on it. These were dragged up by the tail skid and thrown into the horizontal tails, leaving them full of holes. 20 Moranes were thus put out of action. Repairing them took time because of the number of parts in the Morane and the rather artisan nature of its construction. It wasn't modular or easy to put together. Lack of robustness was obviously a big handicap, but chief amongst the many operational issues with the MS-406 was its lack of speed, and a major contributor to that lack of speed was the seemingly clever retractable radiator. The MS-406's radiator is one of those mad pieces of engineering that probably seemed like a good idea in the design office after a couple of restorative lunchtime creme de menthes, but then should have been dismissed after sobriety returned. At the heart of the problem, there's a paradox. In order for the MS-406 to get to maximum speed, drag needed to be kept to a minimum. This meant reeling the radiator in so that it was neatly tucked inside the fuselage. But, of course, to give maximum speed, the engine needed to be at full throttle, thus generating maximum heat, which needed to be radiated away and thus required maximum airflow over the radiator. Therefore, the MS-406 could not maintain rapid acceleration or maximum speed for more than a minute or so before the engine overheated. In reality, the only advantage of the system was during full power climbs, where the efficiency of a fixed radiator was reduced due to the limited speed. That gave no advantage over the Bf-109E, though, which was also equipped with a retractable radiator, and that predictably worked correctly. When the Morane's radiator was deployed, it was quite draggy because of the way that it stuck out and its poor fitment and sealing. The pipework was also too complicated and it didn't provide great cooling. This roaring success was identified as early as September 1938. One Commander David, who worked in the Air Minister's office, reported that SNCOW officials in Bourget told him that it was impossible to maintain maximum speed on the aircraft for more than 2 minutes without risking burning out the engine. SEMA dismissed the problem, saying that in their testing the radiator coolant temperature stabilized at 113 degrees against 120 degree maximum safe temperature. Even if this was correct, then the margin for safety was pretty small. Anywhere on the cooling system would see efficiency drop and inevitably cause a problem. Morane-Saulnier did attempt to fix the basic engineering, but they didn't really manage it, even with the 410, an improved 406 that was ready to fight just as the Battle of France began. Radiators, it seems, were beyond them. The Air Ministry's assessment was that the 406 would have gained about 20 miles an hour in top speed with a fixed radiator. The result was an aircraft without enough of a speed margin over German bombers to be an effective interceptor. Reports abound of Morane patrols having pursued Dorniers or Heinkels without being able to get within firing distance. Even if they did catch the bombers, they then had insufficient pace to re-attack. Although propaganda had the top speed as 486 kilometers an hour, or 300 miles an hour, like a hurricane, the real speed was well known by the Air Ministry and SEMA to be 465 kilometers an hour, or 288 miles an hour. And that was actually the maximum speed SEMA obtained when testing a production batch. The lowest was 457 kilometers an hour, or 283 miles an hour. The maximum depended on the exact propeller fitted. Propeller production was another major problem for French industry, and they never succeeded in producing anything like enough units, resulting in most types of French aircraft being fitted with several different types, from the sophisticated to the obsolete. SEMA actually suggested that the entire of that batch be rejected because of the lack of performance, but the Air Ministry was desperate, and they, and all other Moranes, were accepted for service. Some official documentation pegs the operational maximum as 450 kilometers per hour, or 280 miles an hour. That is less than 30 miles an hour faster than a Gloucester Gladiator biplane. The radiator was part of the problem, but it mainly exacerbated a lack of power and poor aerodynamics. The 36-litre Hispano motor gave a nominal 860 horsepower and weighed about 430 kilograms. The engine's actual rated power was 650 horsepower, but again, propaganda turned the wick up a bit. The Bf-109's 34-litre Daimler-Benz 601 gave about 1,100 horsepower in a 600-kilogram package. The Merlin 3 and the Hurricane Spitfire made 1,300 horsepower, but it was heavier still at a bit over 770 kilos. The engines were packaged in roughly 2,500 kilo fighters, so hundreds of kilograms did make a difference, but nowhere near as much as the extra power did, particularly in the Morane-406's inefficient packaging. The Hispano engine also wore very badly, and many of its already quite limited horses galloped away after only a few sorties. All of these failings, the lack of speed, the lack of robustness, insufficient firepower, and difficult maintenance, came home to roost almost as soon as France declared war. There was little in the way of intensive action in the Phony War. Both sides began by testing each other's defences with photo reconnaissance flights. The Germans flew far more of these, which would give them a major advantage come May 1940, but French aircraft also did go aloft. The vulnerable Moreau 115 and 117, Potes 637, and sometimes the latest 6311s were often defended by Moraines. And from the get-go, they were engaged by Bf-109s, many, but not all of which were the latest E model. MS-406s flew about 5,000 sorties between September 1939 and May 1940. Kill claims are a bit hard to assess in this period. Moraine pilots were credited with 32 kills, of which 13 were Bf-109s. In exchange, 13 406s were lost in the course of combat with German fighters and bombers, and another 33 were lost for other reasons. Some of those would have been damaged and deemed unrepairable. German pilots claimed 25 Marines shot down. And then on the 10th of May 1940, the real battle began. Marine squadrons and their pilots were confronted by literally thousands of German aircraft. At the end of the battle, Morane 406 pilots managed to shoot down between 175 and 167 German aircraft, both fighters and bombers. The cost was around 380 Marines shot down or so heavily damaged as to become combat ineffective. 278 MS-406s were combat ready on the 10th of May 1940. They were hard pressed from that moment onwards. The lack of speed and firepower made engaging waves of German bombers challenging. That issue was compounded by the fact that the Armee De L'Air deployed fighters in small groups, meaning that half a dozen Marines were up against as many as 24 Heinkels. In one such engagement, a formation of 6 Marines chased a Heinkel 111 for 60 miles with no result other than the loss of one of their number. On occasion, experienced pilots could perform miracles in the aircraft. On the 13th of May, 6 Marines shot down 6 Bf-110s in 20 seconds, but then lost 4 aircraft almost immediately when the Bf-110s rallied. On the 8th of June, 1 Marine pilot apparently shot down 3 Bf-109s in 15 seconds. But for the most part, the Marines were the ones being shot down. Of the 380 or so Marines lost, somewhere in the region of 150 were to fighters and flak, 100 were due to battle damage or accidents, and the remainder were destroyed by the French as they retreated. A Marine did succeed in scoring the last French kill of the battle, when an HS-126 was shot down on the 24th of June. The kill-to-loss ratio was roughly in the region of 2 to 1. This was, in fairness to the aircraft's many critics, the worst statistic of any French fighter aircraft. The Germans had little interest in the Morane post their victory, and although they did take some home for study, in general the aircraft was scrapped by the Vichy or the Germans. Encounters with the Allies did occur afterwards. Marines engaged Fleet Air Arm Fulmars off North Africa in June 1941 and suffered heavy losses. 4 Marines also rose to defend Madagascar in May 1940. They shot down a martlet and then were shot down in return by his mates. By the time that Germany occupied Vichy France in November 1942, only 46 aircraft were in usable condition. A very small number of aircraft whose pilots had fled from Vichy-held Syria just before the French surrender served with the British in North Africa until spares ran out. Amazingly, the French succeeded in tempting some export customers with the 406, on the strength of its Paris Air Show appearance in 1936. The Swiss acquired 2 aircraft made in France and then license-built another 82 as the D-3800. They had some minor differences from the French aircraft, including deletion of the external ring and bead sight and the sensible fitment of a tail wheel rather than a skid. The Swiss then designed and produced 207 D-3801s with an uprated license-built version of the 12Y motor, producing 1,000 horsepower. Sensibly, these also switched the retractable radiator for a fixed one. China, Poland, Belgium, and Lithuania ordered 406s, but none received them. China's dozen aircraft made it as far as Haiphong, where they were then seized by the French. The Finns did get their 45 aircraft, and in typical style used them heavily and well against the Russians. When advanced Yak 3s and 7s began to appear, the Finns re-engined their remaining 406s with captured Russian M105 engines, and supplemented by about 30 aircraft that arrived courtesy of the Germans, continued to use the type until 1945. With the M105, the Morane could finally exceed 300 miles an hour in level flight, and retained its good horizontal turning performance. In all, 1,176 Morane 406s were built, making it the most produced French fighter aircraft of the Second World War. The failings in its design and in the low quality of the engines, guns, and other equipment that it carried are symbolic of the industrial failings of France in the 1930s. The lessons therein were well heeded by those who survived to rebuild the French aviation industry in 1945.